Market-based versus interventionist supply-side policies. This video is designed to support or augment or build upon the things we talked about in class, which were the policies discussed and laid out in Jocelyn Blank's book. These market-based and interventionist supply-side policies come to us from Jason Welker, and I'm going to use them to augment or support or to further clarify the differences between these two supply-side policies. So as you take a look at this page right here, you can see that we're going to talk about market-based supply-side policies, we're going to talk about interventionist supply-side policies, and we're going to provide ourselves with three different examples of each. For market-based, we're going to talk about one of the ideas they have is deregulation of industry. Another one they have is the privatization of public industries. Another idea they have of reduction or elimination of minimum wages, unemployment, and health benefits for the nation's workers. That's the market-based supply-side policies. Interventionist supply-side policies will look at infrastructure investments, building better roads, bridges, tunnels, mass transit, and whatnot. Increased spending on education. Increased spending by governments in research and development. But if you look at these two sets of policies, they would appear to be opposed to one another, and in many ways they are. But what I want you to realize right from the get-go, and that's why this graph is right in the middle, is that they are different means to the same end. And the means is either to get the government out of the economy, and therefore it would be a market-based policy, or the idea is to increase government involvement or in the economy, and therefore stimulate the economy from the supply side. So what does that mean? Okay, situation number one. Imagine ourselves in a situation like this. Look at, you have the short-run aggregate supply curve right here, right? You have the long-run aggregate supply curve, and you have a situation where you have aggregate demand 1, and look what's happened. This curve is shifted inward to aggregate demand 2. So obviously we know from looking at this that this economy is working below its maximum output, as we discussed in class, because maximum output would be where aggregate demand, the short-run aggregate supply curve, and the long-run aggregate supply curve, if we're looking at a neoclassical model, would meet, right? This equilibrium point would be the place where this economy is working most efficiently. But we have a situation where aggregate demand has been pushed in, which is obviously visible by this shift right here. Okay, so what's the new equilibrium point? Well, the new equilibrium point's right here, right? At a price level E and a national output of Y1. Okay, we'll get to this later, but this can be described as an inflationary gap, or I'm sorry, a deflationary gap, because we can see that there's a decrease in prices, and as a result of that, well, decrease in prices, fine. But that's not what we're concerned about. What we want to do is think about, okay, how can we get this economy functioning closer or back out to the long-run aggregate supply curve? Because we know this represents full employment, and the economy working at full capacity. So how can we get this back out there? By looking at the supply. We know that we've talked about how we could stimulate demand, but how can we stimulate supply? How can we induce investors to supply more? Okay, so the ultimate goal of both of these policies is going to be to move, or figure out a way, to move the short-run aggregate supply curve outward. We want to make sure, we want to try to shift this curve out so that we create a new equilibrium point where we've returned to the original output that the economy can produce, the total potential output. But look what's happened. We have a decrease in prices, which over time isn't necessarily a bad thing. I understand that's deflation and that the prices are going down, but we'll talk about that in a later video. Okay, so this is the situation I want you to think about. You are in charge of a government, and you need to figure out a way, using supply-side policies, to move the economy back out towards where it had been, operating at the long-run aggregate supply curve, out to where it had been, right? Before okay, you get it. Okay, so what would that look like? Well, here we go. If we look at the market-based supply-side policies, what are they? They are policies implemented by a government aimed at encouraging production and consumption by the free market, and thus stimulating economic activity without increased government intervention. If you think about this, this is the process of getting the government out of the economy, and as a result, market forces will lead to an expansion of aggregate supply. Short-run aggregate supply curve will shift out, and therefore, by reducing these limits on the free market, we'll have an expansion of aggregate supply. So, what are the ideas there? Well, one is the deregulation of industry. Many industries are very much regulated, whether it be pollution control or workers' comp benefits, or what's a better example than workman comp? Just basic standards of a workplace. All of those things cost companies money. They cost firms money. Deregulation of an industry leads to lower costs among producers, encouraging producers to increase their output, hire more workers, and charge lower prices for their goods. So if you take the simplest thing, and this is what I should have just mentioned and stuck with it, is pollution. If there's pollution controls on smokestacks for a big major factory that's producing steel, the maintenance, the installation of those things costs money. And if the government pulls out those regulations, those environmental regulations, it's going to decrease the costs for that firm. And the result would be, hey, on the aggregate, an outward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve. Another idea, we'll take those public industries and privatize them. So privatizing public industries, increase competition and efficiency, lowers costs, and will increase employment. Governments are historically less efficient at providing services, goods and services to societies, and so the market-based supply-side policies would say, hey, privatize those industries, take the government out of those policies, and create incentives by privatizing them. Okay, and what would that do? Hey, that would lead to shifting this aggregate supply curve outward. Another thing that market-based supply-side policies makers would say is that to increase aggregate supply, reduce or eliminate minimum wages, unemployment, and health benefits for the nation's workers. Why? Because minimum wages, unemployment, health benefits, those increase costs for firms. So if you could lower the wage competition, increase wage competition among workers and encourage more workers to take jobs at lower wages, well, lower labor costs equal lower overall costs, and that factor production would reduce, and as a result, you would have an expansion of aggregate supply, pushing it out towards the original level of output, which is seen here at Y1. So market-based supply-side policies are designed to extract government involvement in the economy, and as a result of that, you would see an expansion of the marketplace, expansion of aggregate supply out towards, in the short run, out towards the long-run aggregate supply curve. Now, the other way of looking at achieving the same thing is to think about the interventionists. What do they say? Well, interventionist supply-side policies are those policies that involve a greater role of government, but lead to greater productivity or lower costs, encouraging a higher level of production and economic growth and employment. And there are those macroeconomic goals here of low unemployment and economic growth. So what did the interventionists say? Well, they say, hey, the government should improve the infrastructure, invest in infrastructure. Better infrastructure, which means roads, bridges, tunnels, mass transit, communication, high-speed internet, lead to lower costs among the private sector producers and therefore an increased level of economic activity. So maybe the aggregate supply curve has come in here, is now here, or demand is down as a result, or some way the market is malfunctioning, I should say. And as a result of building more roads, you decrease costs, and all of a sudden you shift the short-run aggregate supply curve back out towards the maximum output or maximum potential of the economy. Another way of increasing aggregate supply would be to invest in education. Investment in the nation's labor force through improved education and skills training will make the producers more productive and lead to more employment and output. So a higher educated society will produce more goods and services than one that's not educated. And this is a really obvious one, and it's not really that controversial, but it does take policymakers to think about intervening in the marketplace and providing a merit good, which we know would be underprovided in the private free market. And the last thing that the interventionist might say is investments in government and research and development. So research funded by the government agencies can lead to scientific breakthroughs and ultimately increase the efficiency and productivity in the private sector. So the idea here is the government spends money to increase research and development. Research and development leads to new technologies. New technologies always reduce the costs of firms, and as a result of that, you will see an outward shift of the short-run aggregate supply curve towards the maximum output, or the potential output, really, of a society, of an economy near Y1. So taking all of those together, you can see how it's really quite fascinating. You have two very different means to the same end. The goal is, of course, to increase short-run aggregate supply. You can either doing it by the market-based supply-side policies, which is actually removing government intervention, or, of course, you can have the government get more involved in supply-side policies, and you could take the position of the interventionist supply-side policies, which would at the same time lead to an expansion of short-run aggregate supply in order to get it closer to the economy working at its optimal level, which is represented in the neoclassical model with the long-run aggregate supply curve. So I hope that helps support some of the ideas we talked about in class, and let me know if you have any questions.